literature will switch to capital L literature, as Dana Steglich calls it. Simon said highbrow literature. There are different terms for that. So how can you spoil classics will be the question of Dana Steglich's paper. She obtained her master's degree at the Humboldt University in Berlin with a thesis on fairies and elves in the works of Shakespeare and Tolkien, and recently defended her dissertation on the concept of escapism and the works of Lord Dunsany. And that happened in the Graduate College Gegenwart Literatur at the Rheinische Friedrich-Wilhelms-Universität in Bonn. Currently, she works as a scientific researcher at Johannes Gutenberg Universität in Mainz and is in the research project called Spaces of Translation, European Magazine from 1945 to 1965.
Sorry for that. Yeah, thank you very much. I think this will fit in nicely, actually, with what we started to discuss right now in our discussion of your talk, James. Yeah, I will talk about spoiling the classics, plot and the assessment of capital L literature. To this day, the concept of spoilers and the review culture surrounding it is much more apparent, I think, in film and television than it is in literature. On a practical level, the reason why books as a medium are less likely to be spoiled is simply because the time needed to read a book differs greatly from reader to reader, and thus simultaneity on the scale of international cinema, or what we have as streaming releases nowadays, is rarely achieved. With the exception, of course, of singular literary events, like, for example, the releases of the later Harry Potter novels, or, as we have just heard, serialized fiction. And yet, in recent years, the concept of spoilers and the etiquette surrounding them has broadened from visual to literary discourse. The current blogosphere and booktube communities, for example, frequently discuss whether spoilers in books are okay, or in book reviews are okay. Just last week, I stumbled upon the fact that literary character spoilers was a category on Jeopardy! After the first clue, the host joked, "Sorry for the Great Gatsby spoiler, but it's been long enough." As in this quote, and in contrast to contemporary releases, the idea of spoiling a classic is most often discussed in humorous, sometimes highly ironic ways. See, for example, this series of cartoons, which have also been put into a book now, or this article, which gives away spoilers to classic literary texts as a way for, quote, people to impress at future dinner conversations. In the next 20 minutes, I will take a look at how spoilers affect literature in general, how they are talked about in the context of what I am calling capital L literature in particular, and the age-old divide in literary scholarship that is once again brought to the forefront by the discourse. Along the way, we will talk about the idea of defining spoilers as paratext. We will delve into the differences between reading and rereading a text, which we've just started discussing. And we will look at critical editions as well as literary criticism through the lens of spoiler discourse. But first, to give us all an introduction to the perils of literary spoiler, I'd like to start by showing you, switching mediums, a clip from the TV show Friends, which was shot before the term spoiler was commonly used, but illustrates the stakes of spoiling a good story to someone. The only backstory that I think you need for this clip is that two of the friends have recommended their favorite novels to each other. So as a result, Rachel is now reading Stephen King's The Shining, and Joey is reading Louisa May Alcott's Little Women.
Hey!
How's it going?
Good.
Hey, Rach. How you doing with The Shining?
Oh, Danny just went into room 217.
Ooh, the next part's the best. When that dead lady in the bathtub.
Oh, no, come on.
All right, I'll talk in code. Remember when the kid sees those two blanks in the hallway?
That's very cool.
Oh, all blank and no blank makes blank a blank blank. Oh, no, the end. When Jack almost kills them all with that blank, but then in the last second they get away. Oh.
Joey, I can't believe you just did that.
I can't believe she cracked your code.
All right, okay. Lori proposes to Joe, and she says no, even though she's still in love with him, and then he ends up marrying Amy.
Hey, mine was by accident. All right. The boiler explodes and destroys the hotel and kills the dad.
Beth dies.
Although, of course, the dramatic dimensions are played up here for comedic purposes, I'd argue that from this interaction, many spoiler-defining elements can be extracted. First and foremost, the clip shows how spoilers are a threat to enjoyment. This is probably the reasons why headlines like these, "Man stabs colleagues in Antarctica because of book spoilers," exist. Emotions are running high when we're talking about spoilers. Secondly, we see that spoilers are at their core pieces of information, the possession of which comes with a certain power or control insofar as the information regulates, in the case of literary spoilers, the reading experience. And lastly, the reason why both Joey and Rachel are able to spoil each other's reading experiences is the fact that the information given to them by the other is about a part of the story that they themselves have not yet experienced, making time or timing the final element. Listing these elements shows the different aspects of spoiler discourse we could be focusing on, but in comparing these findings to two other definitions of spoilers, we could make a case for time being the key element here. Benjamin Johnson and Judith Rosenbaum define spoilers as premature. Jonathan Gray also emphasizes the same aspect of temporality when he says that spoilers include any information about what will happen in an ongoing narrative that is provided before the narrative itself gets there. This leads me to add one further element to my list, namely a second path of the reading experience for the reading that didn't happen, but which seems to be the perceived loss on the side of the spoilee. The contrast between the spoiled reading experience and this alternate reading experience, the "what if the spoiler hadn't happened" timeline, is what I will be focusing on today. Now, I hope that Oliver Ruf would have already talked about paratext, so I'm kind of giving just a very quick definition of what I need from the paratextual discourse as a backdrop to my definition of spoilers going forward. Just as any paratext, as Gérard Genette defines it, a spoiler stands on the threshold between text and non-text. Temporality, as we've seen, plays a significant role for both, and they both have considerable power to amplify, to reduce, erase, or add meaning, and thus change the reader's perception of a text or the way they read it. But different to paratextual elements, a spoiler is generally not official, not author or editor intended material which is added to the text. In his study, Matt Hiltz discusses the differences between official and unofficial spoilers. For example, previews or sneak peeks for movies function as advertising. They are official spoilers, as in spoilers given authority by the producers of the movie. Unofficial spoilers, on the other hand, for Hiltz are something like leaks. I'd argue that while official spoilers do fit into Genette's category of paratexts, unofficial spoilers do not. And because of this, rather than defining spoilers in general as paratext, I'd prefer to take the essentially paratextual power over a text, which lies in framing the way a text is read by an individual, and claim the same or at least a similar power for spoilers. Thus, spoilers are, for my analysis, most importantly, a subset of all the material that generates reading expectations. Just like trailers or blurbs or other forms of paratext, they are new information given before the act of reading occurs or is concluded, and thus they change the way in which an individual reads a certain text. For example, from a naive first reading to a more analytical rereading. In his work on fan cultures, Matt Hiltz himself argues that spoilers might be akin to a sort of rereading, which signals a separation between a first reading and a second subsequent reading. A spoiler, as Hiltz argues, can turn a reader into a rereader before their first interaction with the text. The most obvious difference between the first and any future readings of a text is, of course, the knowledge of the plot, which is what most spoilers focus on, and most definitions of spoilers are tied to. Jonathan Gray and Jason Mittel agree with Hiltz in seeing spoilers as a shortcut to the second reading, getting the plot out of the way so as to concentrate on other issues and pleasures. Berlin Klinkenborg says in an article for The Observer, part of the fun of rereading is that you are no longer bothered by the business of finding out what happens. And Patricia Meyer-Specks comments in her autobiographical study on rereading that the energy and plot of plot and characters may overwhelm a reader the first time around, and that her rereading of books changed her view on them. These comments, which all seem to rank the second reading, the one in which the plot is already known, higher than the idea of an uninformed first reading, stand seemingly in contrast to the negative effect implied by the term spoiler, in contrast to the idea that an individual's enjoyment of the text is lessened by the spoiler. If rereading is better than reading, we could question at this point, what, if anything, is being spoiled? Patricia Meyer-Specks answers in a way that we have already also answered this morning or this midday. What suspense the plot offers, if anything, of course, vanishes in a second reading. I know from the outset how everything will turn out. So suspense might be what the second reading lacks. In the triumph of the novel, Albert Gérard adds other benefits exclusive to the first reading. Talk of suspense, of exciting plot, of dizzying ambiguity, of the pleasures of incessant surprise refers to a hypothetical first reading. The second reading, as Matai Calinescu prominently argues, focuses not on plot, but on structural elements, and thus operates in a synchronic rather than a diachronic fashion. At the same time, he also warns that the sharpened attention that this double or the second reading demands may spoil the more naive pleasures associated with the first linear, curious, engrossing reading, which certain fictional texts keep in store for the happy, ordinary reader. So once again, we come upon the idea that by taking away an innocent first reading, or by combining it with a more analytical reading, some potential that the text held, be it suspense or ambiguity or surprise, is spoiled for us. This weighing of the pros and cons of first and secondary readings brings us directly to studies about the enjoyment of spoiled versus unspoiled literature. So let's take a quick look at them. And I do mean quick here because I'm sure we've all read these in preparation for the conference, and also because we have Judith Rosenbaum still talking about it on Saturday. In 2011, Jonathan Leavitt and Nicholas Tristenfeld conducted a study in which they let their participants read spoiled as well as unspoiled short stories and compared their declared enjoyment. The results of their studies showed that subjects preferred spoiled over unspoiled stories. Leavitt and Tristenfeld concluded that in all these types of stories, spoilers may allow readers to organize developments, anticipate the implications of events, and resolve ambiguities that occur in the course of reading. In 2015, Benjamin Johnson and Judith Rosenbaum set out to recreate Leavitt and Tristenfeld's study, but to their surprise, their study revealed the opposite result, namely that unspoiled stories were significantly more enjoyable than spoiled stories. What these studies show, first and foremost, is how hard it is to quantify and thus correctly measure something so subjective as enjoyment, but also secondly, the different functions and effects that a spoiler can have. Spoilers can function as a processing aid, helping some readers to understand a complicated text at first reading and thus heightening their enjoyment. At the same time, to a different reader, the same spoiler can function as a hindrance, giving away the twist before the reader has a chance to speculate and thus lessening their enjoyment. Then again, to make matters even more complicated, studies conducted in the field of film and television studies have found additional ways in which spoilers are used as an instrument of control, but not, as we have seen in the Friends clip, as an instrument of control over somebody else's reading experience, but as a way to enhance one's own reading or viewing experience. These studies on the reasons why people seek out spoilers make it obvious that along with the complicated topic of enjoyment, the different ways in which the reading of a text can occur, the perception of spoilers is also highly dependable on who the reader is. We've already seen hints at differentiating between two types of readers in Matai Calinescu's remarks on rereading. The possibility of a double reading, so of reading synchronic and diachronic at the same time, or rather on the first try, is attributed by Calinescu to the so-called professional readers, aka to people like us, and separated from the idea of a happy ordinary reader. The difference between reading and rereading and this idea of a professional reader who can combine the two led me to broaden my research. In doing so, I stumbled upon a Reddit thread that echoed something that I always warn my own students of when reading a piece of classic literature. The question posed on the Reddit thread was, why do some introductions contain major spoilers for the book you are about to read? This is actually, the image is actually one of a different Reddit thread because I found two discussing the same thing. Before we look at some examples, let's consider introductions in general. The function of a preface or an introduction is to ensure a good reading of the text. First, to cause a reading, and second, to cause this reading to go well. Here now, why and how you should read this book. Addressee of the preface is, of course, the reader, more specifically, the reader who is about to read the text on which the preface comments, which also poses the central problem of the preface. As Jeanette writes, the great disadvantage of the preface is that it is a displaced and even limping instance of communication, since in it the author offers the readers an advance commentary on a text that the reader does not yet know. Just like the Reddit thread, Jeanette already considers both the fact that most introductions might be better situated after the text so as to not spoil the first reading, and the idea that the reason why an introduction is placed before the text might be precisely because it wants to guide the reader into the correct reading. So let's take a look at how some of the best known editions of classic texts navigate this minefield that is the introduction. As a note, these samples are all taken out of my own bookshelf. If your experience with critical editions differs, I would be very interested in broadening these samples. On the one hand, we have critical editions of Oxford World's Classic and Penguin Modern Classics. Both get straight into the introduction. Even editions of, for example, Henry James's Turn of the Screw include no warnings, and some introductions even start with a discussion of central moments. For example, my edition of Charles Dickens's Hard Times starts with, or the introduction starts with, one of the more memorable moments of Hard Times occurs, and then it goes into a detailed description of this important scene. On the other hand, some Penguin Classic editions include publisher's notes directly under the introduction header, which reads, "First-time readers should be aware that details of the plot are revealed in this introduction." Wordsworth's Classic seems to be the most consistent in their use of spoiler warnings. In 1999, editor Keith Carradine joined the staff and began to include a general introduction to the books that he was assigned. These general introductions were printed above the specific introductions written by an expert, and they read, "Wordsworth Classics are inexpensive editions designed to appeal to the general reader and student." And then at the end, "Because the pleasures of reading are inseparable from the surprises, secrets, and revelations that all narratives contain, we strongly advise you to enjoy this book before turning to the introduction." As you can see in examining my own bookshelf, I found plenty of reasons to support the Reddit user's complaint about spoilers in introductions. But on the other hand, I also came across a surprising amount of spoiler warnings already instituted in editions of classic literature, which I found all the more surprising, because when it comes to the idea that you can spoil a classic, my research has time and again echoed the long-held belief that, as Jonathan Russell Clark argues in an article on LitHub, the best stories, the great ones, are spoiler-proof. We find this claim in scientific studies on spoilers. And we find this claim most notably in the field of literary criticism, where the differentiation of two kinds of readers and two kinds of literature is the conclusion to almost every discussion on the topic of spoiler warnings. This is, in my opinion, the reason why out of the two opposing studies on the enjoyment of spoilers that I mentioned earlier, one is given special attention. And it is, of course, the first study by Leavitt and Christenfeld, the one that concluded that readers prefer spoiled texts. The New York Times critic Stanley Fish uses this to defend himself after spoiling the end of the Hunger Games novels, stating that if suspense is taken away by certainty, certainty offers other compensations. In the same defense, he again provokes the anger of his readers by saying that works which deliver to the reader or viewer suspense and only suspense lose their pull when the cat has been let out of the bag, and there may not be much point to re-experiencing them. Which in turn, this sort of scandal around Stanley Fish was commented on by Alison Flood of The Guardian, who doubles down on Fish's criticism, saying, "I tend to agree with him, and anyway, I can't feel too sorry for all his Hunger Games spoilees. Over here, people, Harry Potter lives, Bella chooses Edward, Susan doesn't get to go to heaven. Now go and find some grown-up books to read and stop whining." The senior features editor for the German online newspaper Die Welt argues in an article on prolepsis that moves from passive-aggressive to aggressive, there must have been a considerable loss of level in the reception of artistic creations if today even educated people permanently sound the spoiler alarm. Great literature has always spoiled, because with good writers, it's not so much the material that matters, but the form. However, this presupposes the advanced reader who does not feed intellectually only on television series. Articles like these are quick to point to the tradition of the narrators of medieval epics and the history of heroic fiction dating back to ancient Greece. They see spoilers as a declaration of authorial mastery, and again argue that it is not what is said, but how it is said, and ultimately by whom. Because a good author, a good piece of literature transcends plot, meaning good literature isn't affected by spoilers. Good literature is rereadable. Matai Calinescu makes this claim, although much less forcefully than the journalistic text that we've just heard from, throughout his argument. Calinescu considers and somewhat keeps up the existence of a divide between mass literature and high literature. High literature is equated by him with rereadable literature, while mass literature is purely readable literature. In conclusion, it is clear to see that we've reached the well-known battlegrounds of literary assessment, where high literature and popular fiction fight endlessly, where readers are divided into professional rereaders and naive first-timers, where suspense is, as Thomas Ans quips, a second-rate phenomenon in first-rate literature, and only in second-rate literature is it considered a first-rate phenomenon. This disregard not only of suspense, but of all the elements that we've seen attributed to the first reading has consequences for the way that readers are supposed to or do engage with the classics. When editions of classic literature contain introductions which give away major plot points, or rather take the knowledge of those plot points for granted, this illustrates how even on a paratextual level, the practices of engagement are different for canonized texts. But then again, the practices of adding spoiler warners to classic texts prove that attitudes might be changing, mostly depending on who the imagined readership of the edition is. Thus, coming back to our list of key elements in the spoiler discourse, looking at the practices of engagement with and the assessment of literary classics through the lens of spoilers has shown problems in undervaluing the idea of a first reading, even or especially for a classic text. The deficit of a rereading, as Thomas Ans explains, lies in the fact that it excludes the temporal sequence of reading, the process in which the reader extracts partial information from the text, constantly checks and modifies his or her assumptions about the course and meaning of the text. Or as Matai Calinescu defines it, to read is to make guesses based on expectations and assumptions and to modify them as the reading proceeds. So maybe the key element when it comes to literary spoilers is not time, but the difference between first and secondary readings. Then again, studies on rereading always seem to come to the conclusion that it is impossible to reread a text, not because the text changes, but because the reader does. Thank you very much.